the end of the semester and the holidays and everything else. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
There, in recent years, when it comes to statues and artwork and everything else, it has, if nothing else, it has provoked discussion on maybe tweaking the so-called facts a little bit, correct? When it comes to the state flag, the insignia, statues throughout New England, really.
Yeah, it's maybe about tweaking the facts, or it's also, I think, generally about, sometimes it's a little bit about public ignorance might be too strong of a word, but lack of public awareness. Then you also have the issue of politicization. People get just too wound up with the history and they tend to lose perspective that, yeah, it's something in the past. And so, yes, it's a very complex issue that can trigger all kinds of issues in people. And we're seeing this happening across the United States with statues, state flags or town flags, models, and so on. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, well, the great example you just brought up, state flags, the Mississippi flag, just this year, changed with Confederate overtones that are really disturbing. And I was down there for a few months this year, and it's just, it rubs you the wrong way. And there are times when you have to reincorporate the official signia or symbol of a certain area, without a doubt. So the Massachusetts flag, for instance, is very interesting. It comes about from the insignia, which I think came about, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, correct?
Yes, so the 17th century, which depicts a barely dressed Native Americans who is covered with some leaves, and then a speech bubble comes out of his mouth and it says, come over and help us. And I've been showing this flag or this insignia for years, for like 3 decades at this point, to my students, and they always get a kick out and they're like, ooh, this is bad. Yeah, and so this is the root. We have had several insignia or state flags since then, but in 1895 there was sort of a reintroduction of a Native American themed flag in Massachusetts again.
Above the Native American on the flag, which seems less offensive than what you described, is a sword that, from what I understand, is kind of indicative to the kind of weapon that the Pilgrims used, Miles Standish used, he being the military, I guess, officer, director of Plymouth Plantation.
Yes.
Do you find that disturbing?
Yeah, I mean, the current seal is disturbing for other reasons. Edmund Garrett, who designed the seal, put a lot of thought in the way he designed the seal. And he used the sword, even though the sword is not a Puritan design, it's like bended. So that's a later design because the whole outside of the flag was like reapplied from a different seal. But the sword above the Native American hat is very disturbing because the handle of the sword is based on that of Miles Standish. But also when you look at the body of the Native American, so the body itself is based on that of a Native American, of a Native person who was unburied in Winthrop, Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. But the head that Garrett used was that of a model from Montana in the 19th century, or for somewhere out west. So there's different claims. Some say it's based on a model from an Anishinaabe model from the Midwest. The other claim it's a model from Montana. But to make matters worse, you have like this disjointed, like Frankensteinian, as some people call it, like head on end. Then you put the sword above it. And I understand some people say, yeah, well, but it's a military hold that doesn't necessarily mean it's cutting it off, but it's just bad PR. I mean, any company that would be stuck with a corporate logo like that, they'd be this fast in changing it. And sort of, yeah, go ahead, sir.
No, it's very interesting because, why not use a model of a Wampanoag, a Native American, or Penobscot or Narragansett? Why are we going all the way to Little Bighorn? It makes no sense.
Well, in the 19th century, what people in Massachusetts and all over New England really had convinced themselves is that the local Native American populations, through their intermixing with people of African American descent, of white descent, had ceased to be pure Native Americans. Now, this is the idea of like scientific racism, racial purity, which kind of ends up these moronic ideas in the Nazi concentration camps. And I'm not like making that parallel, but this is sort of the thinking that goes in there. And so people in Massachusetts that thought about Native Americans at all were thinking, well, these are people that have disappeared, right? And so it just seemed natural that the people here that were just not looking Native American enough. And sort of, we often tend to forget that Indigenous people here have experienced 400 years of colonization. And so there is change that is happening, just like mainstream Americans that migrated to the United States, whether on the Mayflower or our Irish immigrants of later years or Italian immigrants of the late 19th century, we all have changed and we don't dress the way, or we also intermix with other people, but that is still part of our identity.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, you know, when I grew up in the Mid-Atlantic region, where the Lenni Lenape Native American tribe was, you know, and you learned a lot because there's a lot of history in the Mid-Atlantic region, obviously, Native American colonization, obviously with Philadelphia and Washington and Baltimore. You know, the Native Americans were definitely marginalized, and to the victors go the history.
Yeah.
And that's very disturbing on so many fronts. I mean, I grew up in a public school system. My parents paid taxes for the school. I learned propaganda. I mean, and it's aggravating at you know, this juncture in my life to realize, God, you know, why did I have to get up at 5 a.m. and listen to this? I could have, you know, just read some fiction.
Yeah, no, and this is why I personally volunteer a lot of my time to do library talks. And so I give a spiel on Native American history, but also the seal is always my starting point.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a good launching pad in how we need to unlearn history. And I don't do this because I'm like here, well, this is like my personal wokeness, or I want you to experience, what is it? White fragility is another one of wokeness or white fragility. I've been getting I get a lot of hate mail throwing these terms at me.
Really?
But the fact of the matter is, why I do this is like, the past is in the past. So this is not your responsibility, but we need to unlearn what you're saying is, whether you want to call it lies or myths, or I don't even care, but what I care about is sort of have a better understanding of historical processes and what has happened in the past. And that we use then this understanding to be kinder to each other, but also to have a more open mind, also then to understand whether we're going to keep the state flag or we get rid of it. To at least, I want every person in the Commonwealth to understand, okay, Miles Standish's sword. Miles Standish used a sword to cut off people's heads. The belt on the seal is based on King Philip's belt, who was in 1670s killed in battle and then decapitated, and his head was piked outside of Plymouth. So it was up there for 2 decades, correct? Yes, must be quite.
And this is Miles Standish, the guy who, you know, Longfellow told me that he was a romantic.
Yeah, and maybe he was to some degrees, but there's also, like, people have layers, right? And there's also another side of Miles Standish. And we're living, and especially when we're dealing with the 17th and 18th century, there's a lot of violence that is going on. And the violence goes both ways. So Native Americans either initially had already decapitated people as well. It was not just an English military package, or because maybe through their contact with Europeans started to do the same thing, because that's happening to our guys, so we're going to do it to their guys. I'm not entirely sure, and I think on the evidence it's extremely hard to prove this, but these are the kind of things that I want people to have some awareness for. Or with the issue of scalping, which is another one of my favorite subjects. We tend to think, oh, scalping is done by Native Americans. What we tend to forget is that Massachusetts Bay Colony passed numerous scalp bounties. From the 1680s, for example, to the 1750s, there's 60 to 70 of those. And those paid money, not only to kill Native Americans and produce their hair as evidence, but these were also targeted towards women, elderly, and children. And again, there's a lot of violence that happens towards colonists from the Native American side, but this is kind of a very these are very incriminating documents. And this is just a period from 1680 to the 1750s. They go back all the way to the 1630s that colonial governments have passed these things. And that's a pretty, I mean, today we would call this, and I'm always reluctant to like use modern language and modern terminology, but a document like this, a scalp bounty, as they were called like that, today we would call those evidence of a genocidal policy. And that will unravel people the wrong way. But again, I'm not proclaiming you have done this genocide, but in our past, this has happened. And this is I believe as a historian, we need to acknowledge this past, because we won't be ever able to move forward rationally as a country unless we sort of stick to some basic facts.
Yeah, it just seems like you're trying to get to the truth. You're not talking about white supremacy. You're not talking about, we did colonize. There's no doubt about it. But the more I read about New England history, the violence was tamped down when I was a little boy, reading about this stuff. And, Spencer Tracy and the Mayflower Adventure, the Plymouth Adventure, Miles Standish and the Longfellow poem. And that brings me to, you brought up a good point about the bounty, Hannah Duston, which is a statue that seems to be, there are various statues in Massachusetts, also, I believe, New Hampshire. First woman depicted in a statue in the United States, which I think is good. But at the same token, there seems to be a quid pro quo when it comes to violence done to her and retribution and revenge. Yes. And she made money off the scalps, from what I understand.
And quite a bit, and her two assistants too. And again, the people that Hannah Duston slayed, and again, like, let's contextualize it. She was taken as a captive. And what French and especially their Native American allies did is they took captives that were then sold back, either adopted into indigenous society, but by the 18th century, increasingly to be sold back to the English. So it was a way to monetize, right? So I'm sure she might have lost her child. There's some debate on that by historians. But I mean, she was, I'm sure, traumatized and had an axe literally to grind. At the same time, when she escapes, she kills 6 children. She would have killed a 7th child with her 2 assistants. They killed an old man and 2 women. And there was only one person in this camp that was actually of fightable age. And he had been probably a former slave or servant in Mass Bay Colony. So had kind of like a history of trauma and revenge himself. Then they scalped all these people. They could have just killed them and left and run for home, and got a very lucrative deal out of this. So a scalp in various years, it could be twice the salary of a soldier. So what we have here too is not only that the military and the scalp hunting, but we also have another like New England hero like John Lovewell, who is by all intents and purposes a scalp hunter. And these are like privateers that go out to scalp hunt. John Ting, who Tingsboro is named after, same thing. Spencer, Massachusetts, named after a former scalp hunter. Now, they've had more layers to their life, and there's more to them. And I'm sure they were maybe good fathers, maybe good members of their community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is also part of their story. And so I think this is an important part we need to tell. And also we kind of have sort of this myth history. And it's often like kind of based on like, the wonderful colonists, or the wonderful victimized Native Americans. And unfortunately, the history is a lot more complex and dirty, but I also think a ton more interesting and worth learning.
I definitely, I agree with you 100% on that. I believe Hannah Duston, with the bounty that she got, was able to buy some more land in Massachusetts. What is the state, going back to the seal and the flag now, is the state doing anything? I know Governor Baker appointed an all-volunteer panel to do something, to look into it, to reference it, to research it, to see if it needs changing. And it seems like it's stalled in the autumn of this year, 2020.
Yeah, that's the sense I'm getting. I've had a student researcher who's been doing a lot of work on the seal for a public signage project that we're doing up in Lowell. And she has been trying to approach and get more information on this. And And she has had very little success in finding any information on this, either from the state or committee members. So I think there is probably going to be some movement, and I think something will happen, but it will take quite a bit of time, or more time than initially thought. That's the only thing I can gather on what I've been piecing together through this and what I can read in the media.
Now, in Arlington, we have the Dallin Art Museum. Cyrus Dallin, one of the foremost sculptors of American history. He did Appeal to the Great Spirit, which is the huge statue, Native American statue in front of the Art Museum in Boston. We have what's known as the Menominee Indian or the Menominee Hunter. And it's caused, I'm not going to say a brouhaha, a minor controversy. Is he being depicted well? However, it's not like Hannah Duston or Miles Standish or a figure of history. It's art. So art is subjective. It's interesting to see people at least talking about it. It just, if nothing else, the Confederate flag in Mississippi, the Hannah Duston statues, and everything else you're talking about, the seal, the flag in Massachusetts. I don't know who said it. Maybe it was Socrates. I don't know. But it's like knowledge begins with discussion and not silence. Yep. So at least it provokes discussion. And from your perspective, to me anyway, it doesn't seem like you're trying. You don't have an agenda. You're not trying to even balance the scales. I mean, because there was wrongdoing, I think, on both sides from what I read in our history. But it seems as though at least it's provoking discussion and may make a positive step forward in learning about our true, not propaganda, true history. No Spencer Tracy Mayflower adventures,
Yeah, I think you put it perfectly, Jeff. And I think this kind of discussion is very healthy. And I think as a society, we need to have more discussion on issues, and it needs to be informed, and it needs to be without yelling at each other. And I'm afraid that sort of this kind of stuff also gets hung up in the culture wars that we've been fighting for quite a few decades, but a discussion that has become really, I use the word nasty.
It's a good word.
In the last 4 or 5 years, probably earlier than that, but it's become really out in the open. So yes, no, I agree. It's a healthy debate. That we tend to think about people as good or bad, and unfortunately, people are neither good or bad. They're people, and people do good things and people do bad things. And we all know in our own lives that we have many failures and have failed upon people, and people in the past are exactly the same way.
Well, we're as human, and we're all human. So obviously, there's going to be good and bad on both sides. And as you say, history is way more complex than what I learned when I had to get up at 7 a.m. and traipse to school and learn that Miles Standish was the gift of New England. And I'm not downplaying him. Yep. He obviously had a very constructive side, and he befriended many Native Americans. However, the violent part of his life, the heads on the pikes for 20 years, the wars, the brutality, the carnage, is something that I didn't learn. However, if you want to know the man, you got to learn the whole package.
And though I want to defend Miles Standish, he had nothing to do with the King Philip had. By that point, he had passed.
Oh, okay.
So because this is 50 years after the Mayflower. But yes, and again, he was the guy hired to be in charge of security. And when he felt threatened and the interest threatened, and this encounter where he decapitated a Massachusetts Native American, there was probably also some Wampanoag or what we today call Wampanoag, so the ancestors of what we call today the Wampanoag, manipulation to get them into this conflict. And there were other colonists that were allied with Massachusetts. So it's a very complex story. It'd be another program of 20 minutes, and there's probably historians better qualified than me to have that discussion with.
Well, Professor, I could talk to you for hours. This is really interesting stuff, because New England is ripe with absolute golden nuggets of history. And, just put it out there and let the people decide and think for themselves on how to interpret certain figures in our history and not have it spoon fed to us that seems to be rounded out and everyone is immersed in marble.
Yeah.
And it's just not that way.
Yeah, and I do think there is a lot of educators, primary school teachers and other teachers that are really trying to do better, but they also don't have the resources. And if you're teaching math, you're teaching English, and then you have like a couple of weeks in social studies, but you also need to prep these kids for the MCAS and that stuff. I mean, teachers have a lot of balls to juggle, and then you throw in the pandemic where you have to make sure the kids are COVID tested, they keep their masks up, and they're kinder to each other because they have been in some instances home for several weeks, or just going to school 2 mornings or 2 days out of the week. I mean, teachers have a lot on their plate. And so it'd be good too for the Commonwealth to provide better resources in this area, and also put more emphasis on history education, which we don't do. It's all math, it's all science, and it's all English literacy. And I think the chickens are coming home to roost, that we really need to do more civic awareness, but also, like, we are part of a society and we need to take better care of each other. It's not only about me, it's also about how we interact with people in other communities. And history and studying the history of other peoples can also be a good lesson into sort of say, how can we maybe copy things from other society to make a better society, or how we can learn about resilience of people in the past and overcoming challenges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I think you're right about the chickens coming home to roost. If you don't know your history, you're condemned to repeat it. And I truly believe that. And math and science, I really wasn't that interested in. I was more interested in history. So I could talk to you for hours. Anyway, I know you have other things to do. The holidays are abound. You're ready for the spring semester, so you have things to do. But I would love to keep in touch with you on other historical stories, because Arlington obviously is rife with a lot of history itself. And I certainly appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff, and a good holiday and a restful period to you and the members of your audience.